Ever wondered what it'd be like to, actually have God over for dinner? Like offer him some hospitality and hear his plans firsthand. Well, that's what we're diving into today. Genesis chapter 18.
Oh yeah, it's one of those chapters that it grabs you, doesn't it? That incredible blend of the everyday stuff and the divine, all in this really intimate encounter between Abraham and God.
Okay, so let's jump right into verse 1. It says, "And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day." What stands out to you about this opening scene?
Well, first off, the setting itself, the plains of Mamre. This isn't just some, random location. It's where Abraham settled near Hebron, a place already full of history and religious significance.
Got it. So the setting is important. And then you've got Abraham just chilling at his tent door, trying to escape the heat, probably. It's such an everyday image, right? Like we're peeking into a normal day in Abraham's life.
Exactly. And then, bam, the Lord appeared unto him. The text actually uses the name YHWH, which is super significant because it represents that the personal covenant-keeping God of Israel, not just some, vague divine force, but the God who has a relationship with Abraham, that God who made promises to him.
So we've already got this sense of like anticipation, like something big is about to happen. And then in verse 2, things get even more interesting. It says, "And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground." 3 men just show up.
Yeah, this is where it gets really fascinating. It's deliberately ambiguous at first, but we later find out that one of these men is actually God himself, appearing in human form. Theologians call it a theophany. It's like God putting on a human disguise to have this like face-to-face conversation with Abraham.
Wow, talk about an unexpected visit. Abraham sees these 3 men and doesn't even hesitate. He runs out to greet them, bows down to the ground. It's like he instantly recognizes that these are not ordinary visitors.
Right. It's as if he can sense the divine presence, even though they appear as ordinary men. And this takes us to verses 3 and 4, where Abraham shows this incredible hospitality.
Yeah, he's like, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree." He's pulling out all the stops, offering them water to wash their feet, inviting them to rest in the shade. It's that level of hospitality that's just like ingrained in the culture.
Absolutely. And this is so important because Abraham's hospitality kind of foreshadows a bigger theological point. Think about it. God, in the person of Jesus, would later come to earth, in human form. And how are we called to respond to Christ? With that same, radical welcome that Abraham shows here.
It's like Abraham's actions are like a blueprint for how we should welcome Christ into our lives. Now, verses 5 through 8, Abraham goes even further, preparing this whole feast for his guests. He's like, "And I will fetch a morsel of bread and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on, for therefore are ye come to your servant." And they're like, "So do as thou hast said." Then Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth." And Abraham ran unto the herd and fetched a calf tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. And he took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. He is not messing around. It's like a 5-star biblical dinner party.
Right. I mean, we're talking tender calf, fresh bread, butter, milk. He's offering the works. This isn't just about cultural norms. It's about Abraham recognizing that divine nature of his guests. He's responding with the very best he has to offer.
And this brings us to verse 9, where they ask him, "Where is Sarah thy wife?" And he said, "Behold, in the tent." This seemingly simple question is actually setting the stage for something huge.
Oh, it really is, because in verse 10, God drops a bombshell. He says, "I will certainly return to thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son." And remember, Sarah's 90 years old at this point.
Talk about a plot twist. A son at 90. I don't blame Sarah for her reaction at verse 12. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, "After I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also." Okay, I get it. I think most of us would probably have a good chuckle if we were in her shoes.
It's a totally human response, yeah. But it's interesting because Sarah's laughter actually reveals a deeper struggle with faith.
How so?
Well, she's questioning the very possibility of God's promise. It seems so outlandish, so beyond the realm of human experience that she can't help but laugh.
So her laughter is masking a fear that maybe God's power isn't as limitless as she thought. And this is where God steps in with a powerful rebuke in verse 13. He says to Abraham, "Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child, which I'm old?" It's like God saying, do you really think anything is impossible for me?
Exactly. And then in verse 14, he drives the point home with that iconic question. Is anything too hard for the Lord?
This verse is like a lightning bolt. It challenges us to, confront our own doubts and limitations. If we truly believe that God is all-powerful, then no promise is too big for him to fulfill.
Absolutely. And it's a question that echoes throughout Scripture. Think of Mary's miraculous conception of Jesus. Another situation where human logic and understanding were completely defied by God's power.
Right. It's a good reminder that with God, all things are possible. But speaking of human nature, Sarah, out of fear, tries to deny her laughter in verse 15. And Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. But of course God, being all-knowing, sees right through it and says, Nay, but thou didst laugh.
This little exchange reveals so much about God's character. He's not this distant, authoritarian figure. He's patient, he's understanding, and he knows our hearts even better than we know ourselves.
Okay, moving on to verses 16 through 19, things take a bit of a turn. The mood shifts as God prepares to leave Abraham's tent and head towards Sodom. And he does something really profound. He reveals his plans to judge the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah.
This is huge. It signifies the depth of the relationship between God and Abraham. God chooses to confide in him, sharing his divine plans, almost as if he's seeking Abraham's counsel.
Like God saying, Abraham, you're my friend, my confidant. I'm going to let you in on what I'm about to do.
And it speaks to God's desire for us to understand his heart, his motives. He's not just acting arbitrarily. He's responding to this real crisis of wickedness in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right, in verses 20 and 21, he says, And the Lord said, Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me. And if not, I will know.
And it's important to point out that God doesn't just unleash his wrath out of nowhere. He's responding to a very real outcry against the wickedness and injustice that has reached a tipping point.
So God's not this, distant, uncaring deity. He's actively involved in the affairs of humanity, investigating and seeking to ensure justice.
Right, and notice how he says, I will go down now and see. He's not making assumptions. He's going to investigate the situation personally.
And this is where things get really interesting. Verse 2 tells us that the two angels head toward Sodom, but Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And then in verse 23, Abraham does something unbelievably bold. He dares to question God's plan. He says, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked?
It's a pivotal moment. Abraham doesn't just passively accept God's decree. He's not afraid to intercede on behalf of those who might be innocent, even in a city known for its wickedness.
It's like he's saying, hold on, God, let's talk about this.
Yeah.
Is there another way?
It's such a powerful display of courage and compassion. And this is where we witness that incredible power of intercessory prayer. Abraham's boldness paves the way for this profound negotiation with God.
It's almost like he's bargaining with the divine.
He is. Starting in verse 24, Abraham asks if God will spare Sodom if there are 50 righteous people within the city. And to Abraham's surprise, God agrees.
That's incredible. But then Abraham, emboldened by God's willingness to listen, keeps pushing.
He does. He negotiates down from 50 to 45, then 40, then 30, then 20. And finally, in this truly audacious move, he asks if God will spare the city for the sake of just 10 righteous people.
It's like he's testing the very limits of God's mercy.
And yet throughout this intense back and forth, God patiently listens and reaffirms his willingness to show mercy. It completely dismantles that misconception of an angry, vengeful God, often associated with the Old Testament. This chapter reveals a God who is deeply compassionate, slow to anger, and willing to spare the wicked if even a small remnant of righteousness can be found.
It's mind-blowing. It shows that our prayers, even those that might seem audacious, have the power to move the heart of God.
And it's important to note that Abraham approaches this whole negotiation with a deep sense of humility. He says things like, Behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. He recognizes that vast difference between himself and God, even as he boldly pleads for mercy.
It's a beautiful balance of boldness and humility. So with this cliffhanger of an ending to their negotiation, does God spare Sodom? What happens next?
Well, in verse 33, we're told that the Lord went his way as soon as he had left communing with Abraham. The chapter ends with Abraham returning home, It leaves us hanging, wondering if Abraham's pleas were enough to change God's mind. To find out what happens next, we'll need to dive into chapter 19.
Welcome back to the Make Heaven Crowded podcast. We just finished talking about that first part of Genesis chapter 18, where God visits Abraham and Sarah. He promises them a son in their old age, but then things kind of take a turn, right?
Right.
God reveals his plan to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham, he bravely bargains with God, tries to, spare the cities if enough righteous people can be found.
Such a remarkable display of faith and courage on Abraham's part really leaves us wondering if his pleas will be enough to save the city.
Exactly. So let's dive into Genesis chapter 19 and see how this whole story unfolds.
Okay, so in verses 1 and 2, we find those two angels who were with God earlier. They arrive at Sodom in the evening. And interestingly enough, they encounter Lot, Abraham's nephew, sitting at the gate of the city.
What's the significance of finding Lot there?
Well, on one level, it shows that God is, following through with that plan to investigate Sodom's wickedness firsthand. Remember, he said, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it.
It's like a divine inspection.
Precisely, but it also highlights that stark contrast between Lot and the people of Sodom. Despite living in this notoriously wicked city, Lot still shows hospitality to these strangers. He invites them to stay at his house for the night, reminds us that even in the darkest of places, we can still find glimmers of righteousness and kindness.
So Lot represents a glimmer of hope in the midst of all this darkness.
Yes, and his actions also kind of echo Abraham's hospitality from the previous chapter, right? Reinforces the importance of welcoming strangers. It foreshadows that New Testament idea that welcoming strangers is like welcoming Christ himself.
That's a beautiful connection. Sadly, though, things take a pretty dark turn pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Verses 4 through 9 describe a horrifying scene where the men of Sodom surround Lot's house. They're demanding that he bring out the angels so they can know them.
Yeah, this scene is incredibly disturbing. It makes it undeniably clear that the sin of Sodom wasn't just a matter of inhospitality, as some have argued. It was rampant sexual immorality and a complete disregard for God's moral law.
A stark reminder of the consequences of unrepentant sin and the depth of that moral crisis engulfing Sodom.
Absolutely. And Lot, desperate to protect his guests, even offers his own daughters to the mob. Tragic moment that really underscores that utter breakdown of morality in this city.
Thank goodness the angels intervened. They strike the men with blindness, right? They urge Lot and his family to escape the city immediately.
This act of divine intervention highlights God's power and his commitment to protecting those who are faithful to him, but it also kind of underscores the urgency of the situation. Judgment is coming, and it's going to be swift and severe.
The angels warn Lot and his family, escape for thy life, look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed.
It's a life or death situation. No time for hesitation or second thoughts. They have to obey immediately.
Tragically, Lot's wife disobeys this command, verse 26. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt.
It's a heartbreaking reminder of the consequences of disobedience and the importance of heeding God's warnings. It also serves as a warning, I think, against longing for those things of the world, even when we're trying to escape danger.
Then, in verses 24 and 25, we witness that devastating judgment that God brings upon Sodom and Gomorrah. The text reads, Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground.
It's a powerful and terrifying image of God's wrath being poured out on unrepentant sin. It shows that there are limits to God's patience and that he will ultimately uphold justice.
So even though Abraham interceded for Sodom, God's justice prevailed. This entire story really highlights that tension between God's mercy and his justice.
Yes, it's a theme that we see woven throughout Scripture. God desires mercy and forgiveness, but he also cannot allow wickedness to go unpunished. His actions are always motivated by his perfect character.
Looking back at the entire chapter, what are some key takeaways that we can apply to our lives today?
Well, I think this story reminds us that God is intimately involved in the affairs of humanity. He sees what's going on, he hears the cries of the oppressed, and he will ultimately judge wickedness and injustice.
It's also a powerful call to hospitality and kindness.
Right.
Just like we saw with both Abraham and Lot, welcoming strangers, it can be an act of obedience. It's a way of reflecting God's love to those around us.
And of course, we can't forget the importance of obedience. The story of Lot's wife serves as that sobering reminder that we need to take God's warnings seriously and follow his commands. And Genesis 18 and 19 are they're packed with these profound lessons and insights. Really makes you think about, how we're interacting with God, how we're treating other people, how seriously we're taking his commands.
Yeah, it's a story that continues to challenge and inspire us, even thousands of years later.
Absolutely.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Genesis chapter 18. We covered a lot today, from Abraham's hospitality to God's promise of a son, that intense negotiation over Sodom and Gomorrah. If you want to explore this chapter further, we encourage you to head over to the Make Heaven Crowded YouTube channel. You can watch Genesis chapter 18 visualized there.
It's a great way to engage with the text, in a new and creative way.
And don't forget to share this deep dive with a friend who loves a good dose of biblical insight. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on what resonated with you most from this deep dive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep exploring the depths of God's Word.